We are talking to Saket Soni today. Hello, Saket. How are you?
Hi, Laura. How are you?
Thank you for asking. We are doing well here. We were just
Mm-hmm.
talking. It's a little chilly for us here in Los Angeles, but
Yes.
and it's actually been chilly around the country. I think the East Coast is getting like some of its first snow in the New York area, like right around now. So it's a cold snap, as they say.
Yeah,
It is. It is.
It's crazy that L.A. got snow before New York.
Yeah, right?
Yeah,
right?
Really,
let's put that in
really
the
crazy.
books.
Yeah, yeah. What a year.
What a year. And it's just started.
It's just
kind
started.
of.
Just started. We're just getting going.
Yeah, I just wanted to, you write, before we start the interview, you write so beautifully about Indian food in your book. And I was wondering what American dishes, if any, compare. Like, what would you say to your family or friends in India? Like, man, you've got to try this American dish. What would be the dish?
Oh, wow. That's such a great question. One of the joys of writing about Indian food is that there is just so much to write about.
Yes.
I mean, it's the process and the flavors and the texture and even the idea of writing about mustard seeds popping in oil. Just
Yes.
that, and
Yes.
it sounds like rain on a tin roof, right in your pan. So it's fun to write about. I lived in New Orleans for 16 years. I still split time between Washington, D.C. and New Orleans. And I think I would tell my family and friends in India about food in New Orleans, Creole food, New Orleanian food, Southern food. Cornbread made in an iron skillet.
Yes.
And it's really easy to add a little bit of cardamom to that and give it a little bit of an Indian turn.
Yes.
Or crawfish etouffee. And it's easy to add a little bit of Kashmiri red chili to a crawfish etouffee and give it
Yeah.
that heat. So I think food, Indian food, particularly South Indian food and Southern American food, meet really well. And I'd tell my family about that, and I'd probably have them try it. Maybe cook them a jambalaya side by side with biryani and see what they think, see how it measures up.
I love that. I love that. And when you're saying Southern Indian food and Southern American food, I'm thinking of comfort food, both of them, right? Like these rich, saucy dishes that have all these flavors. And Southern American food has a lot of heat too,
That's
traditionally.
right. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it's got heat. It's got, there's a wonderful flavor basis of New Orleans food, which
Yeah.
is the trinity of celery and parsley and onion and I think that's part of the similarity is that Indian food is all based on these building blocks of flavor.
Yes.
You just need to know how to build those blocks
Yeah.
of flavor. It's the same with Southern food. Not to mention that you eat Southern food and you feel better
Yes.
about yourself, the world.
Comforted.
Comforted, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you even have a recipe in there, which I thought was genius because you take us through, make our mouths water. And I'm wondering, like, what does this taste like at the end? And then you tell us, like, you can make it basically. Here's the recipe.
Yeah, that recipe, the first time I tried that fish curry
Yes.
that comes right at the end of the book, I had gone through 3.5 years of a journey with these workers. And that was 3.5 years of hearing about this fish curry.
This particular one. Yes.
This very particular fish
Yes,
curry made in
yes.
this very particular pot.
By this particular
that
woman.
person.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. And Ebby Raju, my friend,
Yes.
said, "My God, if you ever reunite me with my wife, she's going to make you this fish curry." And that was the prize at the end.
Yes.
And I got it, and it was, Laura, it was magical.
It's such a triumphant moment. And I don't want to get into all of them. So we're going to get off food for a minute and get into your story. Thank you for that. I am Laura Cathcart Robbins. This is the only one in the room, but I'm never the only one in this room because, as usual, my boyfriend, producer, and co-host, Scott Slaughter, who I call Hun, is here as well.
Hi, honey.
Hey, Hun. So today, like I said, we're talking to Saket Soni. He is a Delhi-born labor organizer and author working at the intersection of climate change, labor migration, and racial justice. He is the founder and director of Resilience Force, which advocates for the rising workforce rebuilding America after climate disasters. The New Yorker wrote a major feature about Saket's work in November of 2021. Saket is a 2022-2023 Aspen Institute Fellow and was named one of Fast Company's most creative people in business for 2022. There's so much more to you than this little summary here, and we're going to get into a little bit of that. But your book, The Great Escape, A True Story of Forced Labor and Immigrant Dreams in America, had a beautiful New York Times review. It was just brilliant a couple weeks ago, right? 2 weeks ago?
That's right. Yeah, what an honor. I was on a flight when it came out.
Yeah.
So there were several hours I was in the air where I couldn't read it. That was a
Frustrating.
very long flight.
Yes, frustrating, because you want to just dive right into it. And your book, The Great Escape, A True Story of Forced Labor and Immigrant Dreams in America, is also the editor's pick on Amazon right now. Best nonfiction,
Wow.
it says. Did you not know that?
I did not know that.
show
That's
you.
incredible.
Yeah. It's, wait, where is my, oh, there we are. Okay. There you can see, editor's pick.
Oh, good Lord.
Yes.
How amazing. Thanks for letting me know, Laura.
How amazing. Yeah. So it is well-deserved, Saket. It is.
Thank you.
We were talking a little bit before we recorded. I have been, Scott has been sharing his time, or my time, his time with me. Wait, what is it? How do I want to say
Our
it?
time.
Yes, our time.
That's simple.
Our time with you as well, because I have brought your book everywhere with me. And I started reading it because I was interviewing you, but I continued reading it the way that I read it because I fell in love with it. And it is, and I've read to Scott from it, so he got to, hear little bits and pieces, which is hard to do because I want to read him the whole thing because,
Oh, thank you.
but
Wow.
but he would go to sleep because it'd be too late at night.
That's how I roll. Uh-huh.
But he was really, engaged in the bits and pieces that I read him, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want to just start with, you were working in New Orleans when you began to receive mysterious calls from inside this heavily guarded Mississippi work camp. Workers were calling you, saying that they were caught up in one of the largest human trafficking schemes in modern history. You got swept up. So this story that you wrote, The Great Escape, which I'm just going to call it, I'm not going to use the subtitle for right now, is the story of 500 Indian workers who were held in those camps, their escape, and the years-long campaign for justice that followed, labor fight, Herculean effort, impact. You were the engineer of all this, which is just incredible. Can you just, if you trust me with this, I'm going to kind of guide you the way I want you to tell the story. So,
Of course.
if you could just set the stage for us, the post-Katrina world, and these U.S. Gulf states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, have oil rigs, right, that are in a state of disrepair or need to be built. They need cheap labor. I had no idea that there was like this plethora of qualified Indian welders, that were kind of for hire. So can you just talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 turned the U.S. Gulf Coast into the world's largest construction site.
Yes.
Overnight, the flooding from the Mississippi River, the flooding that Katrina caused, ruined entire cities, tore homes and schools up from their foundations. Um, you know, broke down entire city blocks. And all of the repairs were being carried out right when I arrived in New Orleans. I was a young labor organizer, and I got to New Orleans and found that all of these rebuilders who were carrying out the repairs and reconstruction of the Gulf Coast after Katrina were starting their days as laborers standing under a 60-foot tall monument to Robert E. Lee. That's where my days started as a labor organizer. I had set up a small labor rights nonprofit to protect workers. I would wake up at 5, get to the Robert E. Lee monument at 5:30. Hundreds of workers would be there, black and brown workers who were rebuilding. There were well over 600,000 homes to be rebuilt in Louisiana, hundreds of thousands of more homes in Mississippi. A vast enterprise, this rebuilding effort. And contractors would arrive in buses, and workers would clamber on. I'd follow the workers and drive out to the distant, dark corners of the Gulf Coast and watch as America was being rebuilt after Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
That's what I was doing when I got this mysterious midnight phone call from a man who sounded unmistakably, even though he was calling from Mississippi, from the Gulf Coast, from the ruins of the 228 area code, which is exactly where Katrina made landfall. This man sounded unmistakably like he was from where I was from India.
Yes.
I knew that because of the way he said my name.
Which was?
Which is Saket.
Saket.
In America,
Yes.
it's Saket.
Yeah.
But he said, "Are you Saket Soni?" That's the way no one says it in America. And I said, "Yes, I'm Saket Soni." I said back to him. He was speaking in Hindi, and I spoke back to him in Hindi. And it turned out, not only had he arrived from India just months before to be part of the rebuilding, but he was one of 500 workers who had been brought from India into Mississippi. He led me to all of these workers who were in labor camps in the Gulf Coast, and ended up being part of one of the largest human trafficking schemes in modern U.S. history. That's the extraordinary thing he led me to.
Wow. First of all, I'm still at Robert E. Lee, like the statue that you would gather under, and just the irony of this being kind of the nexus of your quest, your journey that would last for all these years to free people.
Yeah.
And then, I went down to Louisiana in 2006 with a group of women from Hollywood to build houses for a weekend, and saw some of that destruction firsthand. I was also really amazed by how difficult it was to build a house. I thought, oh, this is going to be easy and fun. It was really hard work, but we actually built one home while we were there before we flew back. And I was just stunned by the destruction I saw. And this was the following year, that nothing had been rebuilt where we were anyway. Nothing had been so it's just the fact that this happened on U.S. soil, and I feel like people don't know about what happened post the winds dying down. You know what I mean? Post that, is it the Superdome? That's
right, the Superdome. Yeah.
Those images, and then George Bush, doing the flyover, and like after the waters receded, I just feel like people they forgot. And so your story picks up there, which is really amazing to me. So 500 men is such a huge number, really difficult to personalize, so that we're invested in them, not just as a group of faceless, nameless men. But you so beautifully take us inside the lives of these men. You tell us their stories. You humanize them for us. And I when you and I spoke before, I'm so curious. As a writer myself, I don't know how you wrote that because there's so much detail about what they're feeling and what's at stake. I'm anxious, at the end of each of their stories. I'm rooting for them. I'm hoping that, this happens for this person or this doesn't happen for this person. How did you write that?
Well, yeah, what a great question. As I wrote the book, I kept getting pulled particularly to one relationship that I had with one particular worker. He was a person who came to be one of the great friendships of my life. And the book was almost a love letter to him, a celebration of that friendship, and eventually also a terrible mourning for the death of that friendship. And that man's name was Rajan. He really was the partner I had in engineering The Great Escape, and although his story doesn't appear first in the book, it was the first one that I really wanted to retrieve for myself as a writer. And as I remembered him and wrote him and mourned him, it became kind of clear that these men would come to life through their love stories, not as statistics or nameless, faceless immigrants, as you say, but as people with dreams, people with families, people with loved ones, people who went on an extraordinary adventure, who took a gamble, and particularly Rajan, and particularly because of all things he taught me how to cook, and because of all of these reasons, he just became a central figure, and I populated the book around him.
Yeah. I mean, you feel that, like the reader, or I as the reader, fell in love with Rajan, like. And your friendship, you're in love with the fact that you guys have each other through this journey, which is so full of peaks and valleys and danger and requires so much patience with each other. The waiting was really hard to read about, like the times where you were stuck places or waiting, and it felt like that friendship sustained you through that, which. That's what I got out of reading it. I want to.
It really did. Yeah, that's a wonderful way to put it. Yeah, absolutely. The other thing about that friendship is that when I met these men, I had really cut myself off from my Indian roots. I came to the United States carrying the hopes of many generations, but by the time I was in New Orleans, I had become an American in all but passport. I wasn't calling home. I wasn't calling my mother. I was so ashamed over failing to send money home, failing to, to be there for my family, that I had, in essence, cut off contact. And so the last people I expected to find at the center of my American life were hundreds of men from India.
Right.
But that's exactly what happened. And Rajan, in a way, the other thing he did for me, and what that friendship did for me was, he steered me home. He steered me back towards who I was and towards my roots.
Yes, he did. I'm so glad you brought that up. I didn't have that in my notes, but I annotized your book, so I made one of the notes in the margins about that because I was really struck by that as well. That coming back to an identity that you were born into, I think is really powerful, and revisiting it in a way with love. Kind of falling in love with who you are again. Is it Hemant? How do you pronounce his name?
Hemant. Yeah.
So I'm going to read to you a little bit. He had just attended one of the required seminars in India, came away bolstered. He had told, or has been told, that he cannot marry the woman he loves by her father unless he becomes, quote unquote, somebody. Yes. And he fantasizes that after going to America for this job with Signal, which we'll talk a little bit more about, that he will return to India with presents in hand, like a watch and some whiskey or something. And his soon-to-be, hopefully, father-in-law will answer the door and ask, Hemant, is that how you say it?
Hemant,
Hemant,
yeah.
sorry. Katan?
Hemant Kutan.
Kutan.
Yeah. Hemant Kutan.
Hemant Kutan, have you become somebody? And he would answer, yes, sir. And then his father-in-law would say, lawyer, doctor, engineer. And Hemant would answer, something better, an American.
An American.
Yes. I love that story. Tell me why American is the best thing he could have come back as.
Well, Hemant is trying to marry his high school sweetheart. And in the world of India, his family is several rungs below hers in station. Now, a lawyer, an engineer, a doctor, all of these are signs of success and stability. But in that world in India, and at that time, and even today, there is nothing better to become than an American. An American means, Hemant has made it. He's gotten to a place that in the Indian imagination, in his family, represents success and mobility. But there's something even deeper to it, which is, for these workers, for Rajan, for Hemant, and for the other workers, their clearest way out of poverty and instability and insecurity in India is to become a migrant worker. That's the way it is for young people in India. They leave home to send money back. But the places open to them end at the Middle East. Indian laborers very rarely make it to America because the United States doesn't accept people without elite educations and in elite professional occupations. Hemant is a humble laborer. And so the idea that he would break in and Rajan would break in and become Americans, what this means to them is that they're going to, rather than becoming career migrants where they leave home to send money home, where they leave the ones to love, to help them live,
Yes.
They're going to come back home at the end of every night from work to their families, be with their wives, watch TV, hug their kids, read to them, wake up the next morning in bed and go back to work. That normalcy that we take for granted in America,
Yes.
That's a luxury for Hemant, and that's why he wants to become an American.
You described that so well. It actually gave me chills because, I won't speak for all Americans, obviously, but in my day-to-day life, that's not something I ever think about. I take it for granted that, the American dream is that you do have a career that you love and a home that you love, and they are both accessible to you, and you get to spend every day, and you get to spend a lot of time there, and it's that idea. And I have known people. I have Jamaicans in my family by marriage, and they come here for 6 months at a time and work, and then rotate out, and then another one comes from the same family, and that's what they do. That's their lives, because they can't stay on their visas and they can't make enough money in Jamaica to support their families. So they come and work, and it's domestic work that they're doing. Wow. Can you talk a little bit about the stakes for these men, the financial stakes, the family honor, the generational mortgages? I guess we can't talk about that, though, until you explain what the process was for them to come to America, right? Yeah. How, why, what they had to do in order to get here.
Yeah, it took me a while to piece it together. It was really a puzzle. That night I got that first mysterious phone call. The caller wouldn't tell me the name of the company, the job he had, or how he got here. 2 other people called me, all anonymous calls. I convinced these 3 men to meet with me and arranged a clandestine meeting that I thought would be 3 men in a church basement. Yes. My Hindi, Laura, was so rusty that I broke down, by the way, and called my mother to figure out what to say to these three men in the church basement.
Yes.
And when I opened the door to that basement, I was shocked to see there weren't three workers, there were nearly 100. And what I eventually understood was that they were among 500 Indian laborers who had been lured to the U.S. on promises of good work and green cards, and convinced to pay $20,000 apiece to come and build storm-ravaged oil rigs in the U.S. Gulf Coast. They lived in barbed wire camps on company property. They worked round-the-clock shifts, rebuilding these oil rigs. And when recruiters came to India, they promised them green cards and good jobs. That's why they paid the $20,000. But the green cards were nowhere in sight. They were, in fact, here on temporary work visas. So these men were sold an American dream and dropped into an American nightmare.
Yes.
So I was piecing this together in the meeting. The meeting was a bit of a disaster, by the way. I gave my very well prepared Hindi speech, and it completely fell flat on its face.
Yes.
Because the room was full of Southern Indians who spoke Tamil and Malayalam, but not Hindi. I did it over again in English, and I sensed as I was talking to them their need and their fear. I wanted to be of use to them. Laura, in another world, I could have been one of them. I could, in another circumstance, I would have been in that room wishing for a lawyer or an organizer to come and help me. And I just couldn't find a way to reach them. And I thought I'd never hear from them again. But what I didn't know is that deep in the back of that room, there was one worker who was watching me. And he reached out later on his own. That was Rajan.
Yes.
He was a welder who then helped me piece together all of the elements of the human trafficking scheme. And help me break it apart.
It's incredible. I'm sorry. I'm thinking about, because you wrote so well about this, just the idea, I think, in America at least, that India is a monolith, and so are Indians. And so you're writing about being Indian from India and not having the language to tell say what needs to be said to these people. You have some, but I'm really glad that you said that, because it's like, people say that Africans, and it's not a monolith either. There are so many different countries and blah, blah, blah. And you actually ended up speaking English and being translated, right?
That's right.
That was like the way to do it. That kind of game of telephone worked that way. $20,000. I really had to read that a few different times to make sure I was reading it right. Scott will tell you I'm terrible with numbers. I add zeros to when I should not, and I subtract them when I should not, and I always
me too. I'm terrible at math. I'm so glad
good.
You told me that. I feel less alone.
There we go. You're not the only one in the room, but that is an extraordinary sum. A life savings for some people.
Generations of savings, absolutely.
So tell me how that was acquired in India to pay, because it's a fee that they had to pay to come here and work. How did that happen?
That's right. That's the part that Rajan explained to me when we met clandestinely. The recruiters came to India and charged the workers $20,000. This represented generations of savings, and workers sold ancestral land. Rajan's family, for example, sold farmland that they had bought with savings over 30 years of savings washed away in a day to pay for an American dream. Hemant Kutan, the young man we talked about,
Yes.
Who wanted to marry his high school sweetheart, he convinced his father, who was a New Delhi police officer, to empty his pension. But even those kinds of contributions just made up a percentage of the sum. After that, workers put their homes in hock. Then they took high-interest loans from violent moneylenders, all to piece together this $20,000. This was given to recruiters. So these three recruiters at $20,000 apiece for 500 workers made millions of dollars. The company got the most skilled workers in the world at a fraction of the cost to US workers. But the workers, like Rajan, they arrived into conditions that a federal jury would later come to call human trafficking and forced labor.
Yes. I mean, the conditions you describe are abhorrent. It seems unlivable. And to have that many men contained in this area, like cattle, truly. So there's a point in the book where you have told us their stories, and you've alluded to who you are as far as your career. Like, we understand that you came there and that you were this organizer and this activist. But there's a point in the book where you pull out your own story to convince one of the workers to trust you, because
right.
there's a, like, everything's about to go down, and it's like the last thing that you can kind of pull out of the hat. It feels like. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, absolutely. This was just as Rajan and I had gone from being uneasy allies to what felt like partners. Rajan was the kind of partner any labor organizer would dream of. We were very different, but we were also enjoying the ways in which, in which we were different. He was a welder from a South Indian warrior clan. He was an incredible strategist, kind of like a human crowbar. He was all angles,
Yes.
looking for leverage.
Yeah.
Brilliant strategist. He'd led previous labor uprisings as a migrant worker in the Persian Gulf, and we connected around all of that. But in many ways, we couldn't have been less alike. He had very traditional Indian values. He was scandalized by my American ways. He would ask me why I don't pray every day. Why don't I have a shrine at home? He asked me how I've been dating girls that are not Indian and why I'm not married yet. But we formed this immediate bond and became partners in building this movement. But then on the night before the Great Escape, the night before the moment where we had to pull off the heist of the century,
Yes.
Stealing Signal's workforce right from under its nose, right from the labor camp, Rajan told me that he couldn't be the public face of the campaign. He'd be behind the scenes but couldn't speak in public. And I immediately understood it was because he was afraid of telling somebody that he was going to leave his job and be undocumented.
Yes.
I asked him if this was the case. He said yes. He didn't want to tell his wife. He didn't want to tell his mother. And I realized that underneath our bond, we still occupied very different positions. Rajan said to me, Saket, we're different. You could pass for American. I couldn't. Out there as an undocumented person. You could pass for American. I couldn't. And I said to Rajan, look, let me tell you a story that I've never told anyone.
Yes.
And I did this because I needed him to trust me. The only way to do it was to reveal a part of myself that I truly had not shared with anyone but him. So I told him my story. And it started really well. My story actually starts when I come to the U.S. From India to study at the University of Chicago. I think my parents, my Indian parents, might have been the only ones in Indian history to let their son come to America to study theater. And that's what I was doing when I missed an immigration application deadline.
Yeah.
So I found myself out of status. At the time, I thought it was no more serious than an overdue library book. I had so many of those. And it might never have been until 9/11 happened. Overnight, like many immigrants, I lost my foothold in American life. That was the experience that turned me from theater to community organizing. That was my education as an immigrant and a person of color in America. And what I shared with Rajan in a really raw way was all of the fears and insecurities, the incidents of racial violence, and my ultimate decision to actually leave the United States because the world of an immigrant in Chicago had become so difficult. I decided to buy a one-way ticket back to India. I took the train to O'Hare Airport, but I was too afraid to leave because there was suddenly a phalanx of immigration cops at the airport, and I thought, if they see that my visa's expired, they could detain me. So I took the train back to Chicago, and on that train ride back was transformed into a community organizer because I couldn't come back to theater. I had to do something about the way the world was. And when Rajan heard that story, something changed in our relationship. We dropped down to a deeper place, and I watched as he called his wife, and he came out as undocumented to his wife, and he readied his soul for the freedom journey ahead.
Yes.
The next day, we executed the incredible Great Escape at the center of the book, with Rajan stronger than ever, and with both of us closer and more intimate than ever.
What happened on that train ride back?
The train ride back, in Chicago, I was at the airport, and in writing the book, I wished in writing the book that I could have had an honorable reason for returning back to Chicago that had to do with my commitments. Right. Unfortunately, it had only to do with my fear. I just was too afraid to get past the TSA agent and be picked up by immigration.
Yeah.
And that train ride back was the longest train ride I have ever been on. Over the course of that train ride, I wasn't just going back to Chicago. I was going into a very different American life that I had arrived for. When I left New Delhi to come to Chicago to study theater, my dad's last words to me at the airport were, "Don't let the University of Chicago know what hit them." The only thing he could imagine for me was hope and success. And on that train ride back, I struggled with feelings of failure, feelings of despair. I truly didn't know when or if at all I would see my family in India again. But getting off that red line train, getting off on the south side of Chicago into the cold, it was a December day, and walking back to my apartment, I knew I had to do something very different with my life.
Yeah.
And it was the day that an organizer was born.
Yes.
I became an organizer, and I think my telling Rajan that story helped turn him into an organizer. That's the day he set his sights on a much deeper purpose in his life than just living day to day.
I agree. I felt transformed when you told that story. I felt the transformation in him, and to have a sense of purpose like that is not everybody gets that. Not everybody knows how to navigate the fear that they're feeling and channel it toward purpose. People don't intuitively get that opportunity, or they don't get that opportunity and then intuitively know what to do with it. There's probably a whole nother hour that we could do about the escape itself. I just want to say, just for time's sake, that you can, I don't know, you shuttle them out like a few at a time to organize it, right? And I love this. There was like fried chicken involved to like bribe the guards, which sounded really delicious, this fried chicken, because was it spicy? Is that what it was?
Yes, there's a moment in the book where there's fried chicken, but inside the batter of that fried chicken are all these Indian spices.
That's what it is,
And
yeah.
so it's a kind of a, it has this
Sneak attack.
incredible kick to it that you would never expect.
Yes, and apparently was delicious enough so that the guards were like, "Yeah, go see some women, go have fun," and because normally no one was in, no one was out without being documented. Someone had to document your movements if you were leaving the camp. So people,
That's right.
Yeah, so these people
right.
were allowed to leave and meet with you. I mean, they didn't know that, but they were allowed to leave so they could meet with you.
That's right. Yeah, that was the genius of Rajan. What he
Yes.
understood was food. You know, Laura,
Yes.
one of the ways in which these men were made to feel less than human was that they were deprived of food.
Yes.
All they were given to eat by the company was frozen rice, which they had to suck with their teeth to warm up enough to ingest. Rajan understood that food was going to be central to stirring these demoralized men, even before they escaped, even before they came out and met with me,
Yes.
just to connect them back to a reason for living, something to hope for. He knew that would have to be done through food. So he started giving me these enormous shopping lists. I would smuggle ingredients into him. He would commandeer the company cafeteria, and he would cook in the kitchen and start to build the men into a movement. And then the escape plan, involved, without giving anything away, wild turkey whiskey, flavored cigars, all as bribes to guards.
Yes.
And then a fictitious Indian wedding, and that's the pretext
Right.
that let us ferry the men out
Yes.
from the labor camp.
Yes, and then the person at the event hall or whatever it was like, "This isn't a wedding." I don't
Right.
understand.
I mean, where's the wedding?
Yeah.
I mean, there seems to be no music,
Right.
women, alcohol,
It's all men.
brides, grooms, cake, or anything else. To which we feebly declared that the wedding was actually a remote wedding. It was
Yes,
happening in India.
yes.
We were just here celebrating.
That was very clever, actually. Okay, so post escape, so there's a march. So this happens, and I'm just summarizing now because we're shorter on time. But you all go to a kind of a local hotel, and now this is also amazing to me, and I don't know how we're going to talk about all this, but now this is being funded by your organization, right? So you're supporting all these men. You kind of calculated out for us. It's going to be like $10 or $7 a day for food, or $10 a day for food, and then plus lodging, and it's an extraordinary
That's
sum to feed and house them all. They're not making money,
when
right?
you rescue trafficked men from
Yes.
a labor camp, you
Yeah.
take responsibility for their
Yes.
food, their shelter, all of the expenses, and I was suddenly tasked with hiding 500 brown men
Yes.
in Louisiana or Mississippi, somewhere in the Gulf Coast.
Yeah.
A conspicuous group of actors to hide until the Department of Justice comes and investigates their criminal trafficking claims. So the only place we could afford to do that was this hurricane-torn hotel that barely was back up on its feet. And then we were on the road on this freedom journey.
Yes, and there's a status that you were hoping for, and I can't remember what it's called now, but it would allow them to work while their case was
right.
being investigated.
That's right. When immigrants bring forward criminal complaints for human trafficking against their traffickers, the DOJ will give them a temporary work visa
Yes.
and a legal status to allow them to stay in the United States and be part of the investigation.
Yeah.
That's what we were hoping for from these men. What Rajan and I didn't realize, though, was that deep inside the federal government, there was actually a set of corrupt agents, corrupt actors who had their own nefarious ties to the company and their own reasons, corrupt reasons, for working against the DOJ investigation and unraveling our plan.
Yes. So I'm so glad you said that. There were so many moments where, as the reader, I was like, gosh, Saket, what are you doing? This is not going to work. Like, you've taken them from this place, but now they have no means of supporting themselves. Now they can't, if they go home in shame. like what's happening, and it felt like a failure, and then something amazing, miraculous would happen, and then I, as the reader, had hope again. And there was, the stakes were returning home in shame to India, like that. Everyone wanted to avoid that basically at all costs, right?
That's right. That's right.
But also there was this tremendous debt that needed to
right.
be paid.
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. It wasn't just shame, although there was a lot of that. Shame was connected to the real life stakes of violent moneylenders circling the family's homes.
Yes.
Ready to throw families out of their homes and take over property, or worse. And so, absolutely, these men were under extraordinary pressure, and we were holding together this group, of 500 people.
Yeah.
And a journey and a legal status, the ability to work that initially we thought would take 9 days.
Yes.
Ended up taking well over 3 years.
And so there's a couple stories that I wanted to tell, and one of them we might have to save for tomorrow's episode, but there's Alvin Ladner's. You kind of referred to him as he's part of the people in a position of power. He's with ICE, right?
Yeah.
He's an ICE agent. You tell his story too, which I thought was really interesting because you actually humanized him for us. And I was like, why did you do that? I don't want to like him. I just want, but it was really, I thought it was really smart writing to be generous and not generous, but there was equity amongst all the stories. Like you made sure that everybody had their story told and let the reader, decide who to root for and how to root for them and make our own, verdict or come to our own verdict regarding it. But maybe,
right.
Maybe we'll talk about Alvin tomorrow in tomorrow's episode. Can you tell us the story of Ebby and the excavator? Because
yes, well,
that's one of my favorite stories in the book.
Absolutely. Oh God, I'm so glad you asked. So, Ebby Raju is another man right at the center of this book. He's just an extraordinary human being. He was a young man in India whose biggest problem before he was trafficked to the United States was that his mother was trying to drag him in, feet stomping, drag him into an arranged marriage. Ebby did not want to get married. Ebby did not want to lose his freedom. Ebby wanted to just live his life. He was 20-something. He had a new, used, beat-up motorcycle, and he wanted to ride it around town and just be a young guy. That's what he wanted in his life at that moment. But his mother wanted him to get married. Ebby was also watching the financial situation of his family. His father couldn't afford to retire, and Ebby wanted to go back to work, back to Bahrain as a migrant worker, and earn money for the family. So Ebby was resisting the wedding for those reasons, but then one day, accidentally, against all Indian norms and protocols, he happened to speak to his bride-to-be on the phone. And he fell in love with her voice. And he decided to get married to her. So they got married, and Ebby took the job opportunity in the United States, raised $20,000, and left for America days after his wedding. His wife was pregnant when she left, and Ebby was expecting to be reunited with her in 9 months.
Right.
He was expecting to meet a newborn child, just maybe a month old, in the United States of America. Well, it turned out, because of the scheme that Ebby was trapped in, he wouldn't get to see his family for another 3 years. The son that was born to Ebby grew up for his first 3 years not knowing his dad. And so the book ends with a scene that I still think was the most gorgeous thing I've ever seen in my life. Ebby at the Atlanta airport, 3 years after he arrives in America or more, clutching a bright yellow excavator, a JVC excavator, the color of his anxiety. He's just so anxious
Yes.
that his son, his 3-year-old son Bobby, is not going to come into his arms. His wife's head pops up the escalator. His son is in tow. His wife runs towards him and hugs Ebby. And then, without even needing a nudge, Ebby's child, Bobby, his son, leaps into his arms. He doesn't even want the bright yellow excavator. He just hugs his dad and calls him Daddy. And that was just the most extraordinary scene in real life. And because so many immigrant stories these days don't end well, this was a rare opportunity to write, a great ending. Every immigrant story is a love story. Every immigration story is a love story. And Ebby's story especially.
I cried when I read it. I'm crying again now because it was so beautiful. And then he says, either he says he's thirsty or his mom offers him water, and then he says, "No, Daddy will get me water.
Daddy will get me water."
Yeah.
It's just the most beautiful, simple acknowledgement of a
but
relationship.
it's music to a father's ears. And then he was so nervous, that the excavator was because maybe I can tempt him, maybe I can tempt him to look at me, to talk to me if I have this in my hand. And
That's right.
Yeah.
Ebby had heard over a series of phone calls that Bobby would scamper around the house in India pretending to be an excavator.
Right, with socks.
And lift up socks
Yes.
and laundry with one hooked hand.
Yes.
And so Ebby spent, I think it must have been weeks. I talked him through dozens of excavators. What color, what size, as if there was one perfect one
Yeah.
that Bobby would be successfully bribed by.
Yes. Oh, and yeah, what a beautiful moment. And I really want to thank you for giving us that moment in the book, because there are stories that didn't end as happily. And you talked about one of them with Rajan, and that was really painful to read, but this was this was joy. This was elation to read, as the reader.
I'm so glad.
Yes.
I'm so glad.
Again, so beautifully done. We're going to talk to you a little bit more tomorrow about more of the ending, and like I said, Alvin Ladner's. That's right? Alvin Ladner.
Alvin Ladner, yes.
Yeah. But Saket, thank you so much for giving us this much time today with your story. It's so beautiful. It is so important for everyone to hear this story and be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for reading, Laura.
Oh.
And thank you for reading so deeply. What a pleasure to talk about this story.
Yes.
and these families with you.
So, Saket, just before we go, tell us where people can find you and what's next for you.
Absolutely. Well, you can find me on my website at saket-soni.com. That's Sony spelt with an I, S-O-N-I. And in terms of what's next, wow, I mean, I am just so thrilled and overwhelmed by the response to this book. I am on a book tour now. The book tour schedule is on the website, and I'd love to meet listeners if I'm in a city where they are. There'll be cities added, New York, LA, and many others over the course of the summer. And I still run an organization. I'm still,
Right.
my day job hasn't gone away. I'm still a labor organizer. And as workers follow hurricanes, floods, and fires, my team and I follow workers. So part of what's next is looking at the coming floods and fires of this year, and preparing to protect the workers who will rebuild America, who will rebuild our homes, schools, and cities. And I'm also with the families and workers in the book, working on a set of recipes that are going to be on the website soon, recipes from the book. So if you want to try that extraordinary fried chicken with Indian
Yes.
spices in the
You read
batter.
my mind. I was like, I want that
you
fried
will.
chicken.
You'll have access to it soon.
That is a wonderful. I'm so glad you're doing that. My goodness. All right. Thank you so much. And we will talk again tomorrow.
Hi, I'm Saket Soni, and I am the only one who freed 500 Indian workers from human trafficking.